Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Maria Ferguson. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Education Policy here at GW. Very glad you can be with us today. We have a really great program, lots of interesting people, lots of interesting presentations and discussions. I am going to introduce everyone shortly when they come up here for the panel, but I just wanted to tell you how glad we are that you're here. This is an important conversation and one that we have been very interested in at CEP for some time now, talking about how we make research evidence more useful, more practical in both policymaking and practice. And we have a number of people here with some very excellent experience who can speak to you about their experiences and hopefully answer your questions afterwards as well. Before we start, though, as you know, we're going to be raffling off copies of this very wonderful book by Kara and Alan, who will be doing the presentation shortly. I have 7 copies in my box. So I'm going to start and do 2 now, and then I'll do some more as we go along. I'm not looking. Rachel Gwaltney. All right, we have your book for you. I'll bring it down after. Well done, Rachel. We got one more. Okay, I want to make sure I pronounce this correctly. Kanami Mackenzie Thompson. Did I get it? All right. Thank you, Tara. Okay. 5 more to go. And as when we take our break before the panel comes up, we'll get to the next one. But for right now, I want to introduce Vivian Tseng. She's the Vice President of Program for the William T. Grant Foundation. She's going to offer us some framing remarks to help set up the conversation before Kara and Alan's presentation. So, Vivian.
Let's see here. Good morning, everyone. I want to start just by quickly thanking Maria and her team at CEP for pulling us together for what I hope will be a really stimulating conversation. And what I'd like to do is something that academics don't do a lot. Instead of talking to you about stats and show you some figures, some interesting research evidence, I'd like to try telling you a little story, which I think will lead us quite nicely into the conversation we're going to have today. So there are 2 men that I've come to know pretty well over the last few years through a learning community that our William T. Grant Foundation has been supporting, where we've been bringing together researchers and school district leaders from around the country. And we've been bringing together folks who've been working together in these deep, intensive, long-term partnerships. Now, Professor Paul Cobb is a national leader in research on math education. Actually, he's an internationally recognized leader. I mean, he's pretty much as big as you're going to get in terms of a researcher who's done some really deep work in understanding how to improve education. And I just recently looked at his CV. It's very impressive. He's written 89 research articles, 7 books, and in addition to those 7 books, 81 chapters in other people's edited volumes. So in 2006, Paul thought he wanted to take on the next stage of work in his research program. And so he approached Michael Sorum, who at that time was Chief Academic Officer in Fort Worth Independent School District. Mike very politely declined. He wasn't interested in participating in yet another study. And in fact, I think Mike declined a number of times. Basically, the district, Fort Worth, had just faced some major budget reductions. They'd had a new superintendent. They had just had a curriculum audit, which was delivered some pretty devastating news to the district. As Mike would say, they basically said that there wasn't a curriculum. And so they were about to implement a new math curriculum. So there was a lot going on in the district that Mike and his team were trying to focus on. And he hadn't had the best experiences with researchers anyway. You know, Mike had been the director of research at Providence School District before he'd gotten to Fort Worth. And in his experience, researchers were often knocking at the door trying to get access to the districts he worked in. And when they were in the district, it often felt like the district and the educators were objects to be studied. And the project sometimes drew down significant time and resources from the district staff. And unfortunately, they wouldn't deliver findings that were useful enough or timely enough for the district to make its decisions. So it would draw down a lot of resources, but not necessarily deliver and return back things that were useful. So Mike was, no thank you. I don't think we're going to participate in your study, not at this time. But Paul, as I've come to understand him, is very persistent. He's mild-mannered and gentle, but he is very persistent. And he was also ultimately very persuasive. And he was persuasive because he had done his homework. He had understood the challenges that the district was facing, the students that it was serving, and the goals that it was trying to achieve as it rolled out a new math curriculum. And so Paul was there not just to test out his academic theories in Fort Worth. He really wanted to know about the district's theories of action. What did the district think that it needed to do to improve middle school math? What were the capacities that the district had? What were its limitations? And what strategies was it going to try to implement? So in essence, Paul didn't want to do research on the district. He wanted to do research with the district. And so those conversations spawned the MIST partnership that has been going on for 6 years. And for the last 6 years, Paul and his team of researchers travel to Fort Worth several times a year. They interview the district leaders. They try to learn what are their strategies that they're trying to implement, what are their theories of action about what's going on. Then they collect data inside all the schools and classrooms to try and figure out, are those theories of action playing out? What does it look like on the ground? And then at the end of the year, they meet. The researchers and the district leaders, the educators meet to discuss what they've learned from the research. And then they deliberate and they think through, what does this suggest for what we should do differently the next year? And then they repeat this cycle all over again. So year after year, they're coming together, trying to think about what they're going to do differently. They collect data on it and they feed it back into their plans of action. So it's repeating these cycles of continuous improvement. And I tell you this story because I think it exemplifies the foundations of a learning system in education. Researchers and districts collaborate to improve education. The researchers bring social science theories, this large body of work that comes not only from Paul Cobb and his team, but also from the broader research literature on math education and about scaling reform in education. They contribute carefully collected data, very precise and rigorous instruments. They contribute the analyses. And then the district leaders also come to the table as full partners, and they bring their own theories of action. They bring their experience with prior reform efforts. They bring a deep knowledge of their local context. And they bring their own judgments about what's feasible to implement. And you can imagine that's a particularly important piece and every year as they discuss the findings and figure out what to do for the next year. So what is feasible to try to implement in the next year? So together, they're learning from each other, and they're learning from the research evidence that they're collaboratively building and using. And Sorum would tell you that this has led to a smooth implementation of that new math curriculum that he was so worried about in the beginning. It's led to gradual increases in student achievement, and it's led to a lot of unexpected benefits. It's brought quite a bit of professional growth and fulfillment to the district leadership in jobs, as I think you guys well know, is often quite tense and challenging. And it's given the district stability as staff and leadership have turned over. I think this is a very surprising benefit of partnerships. Mike is now on his third superintendent. That's not surprising, I don't think, because the average superintendent in urban districts lasts less than 3 years, so Fort Worth has not been different from that national average. And so the partnership has brought some stability in the work. And then what it's also done is, Mike will tell you, it's helped the district focus on making continuous incremental improvements rather than chasing the next silver bullet. Because as money comes along and ideas come along, they can feel like bright, shiny objects. But this work, this continuity of this work, has helped them focus. So to build a more robust learning system, I think we need to do three things. And I think these are three of the themes that I think you'll hear and elaborate on as we go throughout this morning. First, we need to more seriously consider what it means to be able to learn from research evidence, to take it, to understand what it means, and to incorporate it and try out different ways of making change. There's a lot of conversation these days about dissemination. We need to better push out research evidence, get it into the hands of decision makers. But that's really a one-way street. And so I think what we're going to hear today, especially from Alan and Kara, is what happens if you think about it as a two-way street of engagement, not just dissemination, but engagement, where people can have back and forth conversations to apply research and figure out what does it mean for my local context, for my students, for the particular situation that is confronting me. And then I think, secondly, a learning system requires not just technical capacities, but also attention to the social system. We focus, and I bring this up, it may seem obvious, but I bring it up because in the debates about evidence-based policy, evidence-based practice, there's been a lot of focus on the technical side of that work, in terms of evidentiary standards, in terms of increasing the rigor of research, increasing the ability of consumers to understand that research. I'm not saying that we've gotten there, but certainly there's a lot more tension and discussion of those and recognition that those things need to be addressed. But we haven't attended a lot to education as a social system, that relationships matter, that trust matters. Relationships and trust are how a lot of folks, both policymakers and practitioners, come to get their hands on information and decide what they're going to see as credible. And so if we think about it as a system, then we're going to have to think a bit more about the interdependencies of different people playing different roles in complex organizations. So the third thing I think I hope that we'll talk about is the robust infrastructure that needs to be created to design this learning system. It has to be an infrastructure that supports ongoing, facile, easy engagement between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners around research, data, and experience. And I think we're going to hear some different ideas from the panelists, from our presenters, about what that infrastructure might include. What are models that might fit well within this infrastructure? We'll talk more about different kinds of research practice partnerships. We'll talk about the kinds of partnerships that can exist even within agencies at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. Because sometimes the research departments within these agencies and the program departments within agencies are themselves quite disconnected. The gulf can also feel quite large between them. We'll talk about the role of intermediary organizations that sit betwixt and between research, policy, and practice, the roles that they might play. And I think because we're in DC, we're going to think a lot about what the federal role could be in building this infrastructure or strengthening this infrastructure. The incentives, the supports for building capacity to do this work, or the ways in which the federal role can be to simply reduce barriers to allow more of this collaboration and alignment to happen. So with that, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I hope we're all going to dive into it and think about how we can design education to be a stronger system that can both build and take up research evidence to improve learning.
just wanted to give you a proper introduction for Kara and Alan before they come up and do their presentation. Kara Finnegan is the Associate Professor of Education Policy at the University of Rochester, and Alan Daly is Professor and Chair of the Department of Education Studies at the University of California in San Diego. A lot of what they're going to be talking about during this presentation is included in their wonderful book, which is really a collection of studies and essays about using research evidence in education, and I really urge you to take a look at, but you'll get some great highlights during the presentation today. I also want to encourage you, if you happen to be a tweeter, to use our hashtag @CEPEvidence up there, and that's ours as well, and talk about what you think about the presentation and what's going on today. So, Kara and Alan, when you're ready, let's go.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Kara.
I'm Alan, in case that wasn't clear.
In case you didn't know. We have different styles in dress, but this is all coming together. Our minds come together in this presentation, and we also have a number of other people who have helped us along the way. We are so grateful to the W.T. Grant Foundation because so much of our own thinking has changed and evolved through their support of our work and their support of this broader area of research in terms of creating the learning community that Vivian mentioned.
We'd also like to thank a number of other friends that came out to join us today, so we're really appreciative about that. And just on a sort of a style note, you'll know that it's only because I'm from San Diego that I can legitimately wear a scarf when it's 70 degrees outside, so just to be clear. But we're also deeply appreciative to Maria and the team here at CEP. We're also very appreciative from AYPF, who have been also equally supportive of our work, and our friend Esther, who's been blogging at the Albert Shanker Institute around the social side of reform. So there's many people to thank, and we're deeply appreciative. We're really the sum of our parts, and we're appreciative that you're here.
One reminder is that this is an edited book, and so we have a number of people who have contributed, and what we're talking about today brings all of those themes across the chapters together.
And it's so much nicer not to have our moms bragging about our book, to have somebody else do it. So we're also really super thankful to the people that participated. It really was a community of learners that brought all of this together. So we're very appreciative to all of them.
All right. So now we will begin. Like Vivian, we're trying to do a little bit different from your typical academic presentation. So we have a number of images that we're going to share with you, and I'm sure some of them will stick, and it'll be interesting to see which ones do. This one might not be the one that sticks, but we wanted to orient you today to what the problem is that we're sitting within this context, this policy context, that creates importance around thinking about how research evidence is used at different levels of the system. So the first is all the challenges that are in the educational system, and some of this has to do with Common Core, but we've been leading up to this for a long time, and so people within the system itself feel a lot of pressure. The pressure is around changing their practices and aligning to new types of ways of learning and thinking, but also pressure to report back on how people are doing in the system. There's also different perspectives on what research evidence is and its value. And there's a gap, as a result, between knowledge development and knowledge utilization. And that's resulted in a sort of a misalignment between what we have in the system that is valued and what we have that's enacted. Okay, so in the book there are three major themes, and these go along with them. The first one is around translational issues around evidence. The second one is around the interconnectedness that Vivian was talking about of the system that we operate within. And the third is around what we call evidence as learning, which again Vivian alluded to as well. So the first one is around translation. What do we mean by that? So it's people define evidence differently. There are issues around how it is translated to different groups. And there's also issues around the usability, as Vivian was alluding to earlier. In part, there's a lot of knowledge within systems, but there's pressure from outside. So there's a lack of ability to kind of cross over into different sectors to see what's available to learn from. So this creates a disconnect between a lot of the knowledge that's in the system and whether it makes its way into different levels of the system, whether it's the classroom, district level, or for policymakers.
And so you've heard the word system a lot this morning. So it's something that's really important. And that's actually a paradigm shift for a lot of people. Because for a long time, we've thought about the discrete elements and improving discrete elements as opposed to thinking about the interdependent and interconnected nature of the work, right? So we work on improving schools, and while that's important, we know that schools sit inside this larger district system that can actually be quite consequential to the improvement efforts that school is trying to make. So we want to think about this use of research evidence as a systemic issue, or something that really has to be including a wide variety of actors. And so we sort of think about this. You may have seen this sort of famous picture by Edison. And Edison is standing there and he's sort of handing the light bulb off to the future. And while we know that that's a really important thing, the light bulb is a really critical thing, or else you couldn't see all of us here, we also know that the interconnected system of grids and power plants, those are the things that enable all of us to have light. So sometimes we get very caught up in the thing and we forget about the system. And what we're arguing here in this work, and what you can really see across all of these chapters, is we've got to be mindful about the work that we're doing as well as the system in which that resides. But it's not just the system, as you heard Vivian and others say. It's the quality of relationships and connectedness we have within that system. So for example, in some of our work and some of the work in the book, it suggests that people are likely to take up ideas from those with whom they have a really strong emotional connection, even if those ideas rationally don't make sense. You remember some of this from your teenage years, I'm sure. And so this idea about our BFFs being really influential on us is an important one to keep in mind. And in social systems, we have connections to people. And some we have deeper quality of ties with those people. And it's through those deeper quality ties that information moves and gets connected. But there's also another kind of actor that exists in these systems. And we call these actors research mediators. They're kind of like a broker. So I'm going to talk you through what that looks like through using something from California. So this is San Francisco from about 30,000 feet. And you can see San Francisco is surrounded by water on 3 sides. And so in a way, we can imagine that this is not so different than some people in organizations, that they're kind of disconnected or isolated in some way. And when you're disconnected or isolated, you need to be connected, right? And so you start to build bridges. And these bridges represent an opportunity to have otherwise disconnected people be connected, right? So then we build something that looks like this. And on this, you could see the cars are moving, which is not always the case. You can see the cars are moving. And this represents the flow of information and ideas between otherwise disconnected people, right? It forms a connection, a bridge. But sometimes that bridge can get really crowded. It can get crowded with unnecessary ideas, pressures from the system, too much input. And at other times, it can get filtered, right? That we can't always see where we're going to go, that it gets clouded. The same happens in people systems. And let's illustrate this using some of our work here. And so this is the closest you're going to get today to charts and graphs from academics. So apologies, this is pretty close. Let me just sort of walk you through what you're looking at here. So this is a social network. It's a sociogram. And it's a sociogram of a large urban school districts. Let me tell you what the components are here. Each one of these dots, we call them nodes. Each one of these dots or nodes represents a person in this particular system. These people are in formal leadership roles. So if you're in this group right here in the middle, you work in the central office. Okay? So you're like director, superintendent, curriculum kinds of folks. If you're out here in this beautiful rainbow of colors, you are a principal, right? So each one of these clusters represents a group of principals. This particular district is organized by zones and areas. And each one of those zones and areas has one of these triangles here. And those triangles represent somebody from the district office, like an area superintendent. Okay? So this forms a very nice system. And we can learn some stuff about this particular system through the lens of brokers or bridges. So, for example, these area superintendents right here have the responsibility for connecting from the central office to the principals, right? In a way, they're like connecting San Francisco to Oakland, okay? And so what you see here is you see that some of these nodes, some of these triangles are bigger than other triangles. And these are sized by the kind of brokerage roles they play in the system. In other words, how much actual connecting do they do? So one thing that we could see right off the bat is that there are some area superintendents that do a lot of connecting and others that don't do very much. The other thing that you might notice in this system is that there are a bunch of lines here. And those lines represent the movement of research expertise. So who do you turn to get expertise from research? And if we look at these clusters, we can see that not all clusters are equal, right? In some, there's very little exchange around this research expertise. In others, there's much more. We can also see that, remember I told you that the nodes are sized by the amount of brokerage or connecting that they're doing? And we would expect that people in formal roles should be doing more of this. We can also see some of the principals here that actually do quite a number of brokering. So what that represents is a difference between the formal system, in which these area superintendents are supposed to be doing this kind of activity, and the informal system, in which the principals themselves are connecting and moving information. So in essence, what we have at the same time is we have a formal system that's operating, that's codified, written down, people can look at org charts and understand what's happening. But we also have an informal series of interactions that are happening. And in many cases, it's those informal interactions that are really driving change and improvement within a system. And this is within a district system. But you heard Vivian talk earlier that there's actually these intermediaries that play brokering roles, research mediating roles between districts and themselves, between policymakers, districts, and foundations, any number of different combinations. So I really think, and the work would show up, I think, in our book, that we are really in an age of the rise of the intermediary organization. They're playing really important roles, like CEP, for example, is playing a really important role in convening us all together.
So Vivian gave such a nice story of what we have been thinking about in terms of evidence as learning, because so much of the time we talk about things, what are the things that people are looking at, but it's really the process of looking at those things that matters. And as has already been mentioned, there's a trusting relationship that has to exist if you're coming together to make sense of data. And in the current accountability context, that's harder to have happen. So in many of the districts we do our own work in, we see people who are vulnerable to say if they don't understand what the data is suggesting or where the root cause of the problems are, and so they rely on very superficial types of information and move forward with solutions without that kind of a process.
And I think on this point, one thing to mention that I didn't is that in that network map that you saw from Karen and I's work, we actually take that data and feed it back into the system, right? So we're not interested in doing what typical people do, which is to come and gather a bunch of stuff and then disappear to our offices. We want to really use that data to help drive the work of the district, just as the story about Paul was told.
So if you think about that, then you're understanding evidence in a different way. You're thinking about the process of making sense of data or making sense of the different types of research that's available. And people use experience as a different type of evidence. That all can be mixed into the process of learning that happens. And one of the things that we build upon in our work is this idea of the single loop versus double loop learning. The way to think about this is that in single loop learning, you sort of keep the same set of beliefs and practices you've had before and use that data to continue to think about the way you've been doing things in a way. So you might strengthen a particular program that you have or shift a program to a different grade level. You're not really changing much of your thinking around these issues. In double loop learning, the idea is that you would come together and you would question some of the assumptions you've made about that program. You might think about looking at different types of data than you've looked at before. So this process of then using it to reflect upon and change your practices and have them evolve as a group and sort of this iterative process that happens, we don't see that many places. And I think partially this has to do with the fact that those underlying relationships aren't built that allow that to happen. So our three themes come together in the book across these chapters, but we also have 5 cross-themes that we want to share with you today, and then the implications that we believe are important to think about as a result. So the first one is that there are a lot of type of evidence used, whether policymakers are accessing different types of evidence or school leaders are. The issue that we find is that they're used sporadically because of pressures that happen with timing and decision making, and also because there's not access to certain types of information and it's not always valued. And that can lead to a disconnect between the research that exists and the use of it on the ground. Also, as suggested, if there are relationships that are brokering this information, it's like a little bit like the game of telephone. And so you can have groups that are actually filtering along the way, which is good in many ways, but it also can lead to certain ways of thinking about that evidence that exists. So it rests upon, if we have too few people sharing the ideas and practices, then that can limit the understanding of them.
So the other thing that comes out as you look across these chapters is this idea about research evidence being used as a frame. And this is really fascinating because on any number of occasions people will say research says and then sort of launch into some diatribe about what they believe. I've used this on a couple of occasions with all the studies around red wine, suggesting that one more glass of red wine certainly is good for me, so have at it. So a bottle must be twice as good, right? So people use research in a way to sort of frame what's happening. And often they'll do that that's aligned to their own beliefs and values, right? And that can actually set us down very different paths depending on how the research is framed. But what we're really arguing here, and what you see across these chapters, and I think what you're seeing in this growing body of work, is that evidence is just part of the process. It's one of the magical ingredients that enables reform and improvement and change to actually take place. And so if we think about this as learning and as a process and as our connectedness, we're more likely to see this improvement happen. The other part that's really important here is this idea about the reciprocated relationships between practice and theory. Okay? And, you know, for a lot of time we have been really concerned about the rigor of our work, and that's really important. But we've been less mindful about the relevance of our work. So I think in this next stage, as we come forward together into this bright new day filled with red wine, we want to be mindful of both the rigor of our work and the relevance, the connectedness. And it's also an understanding that knowledge exists in multiple locations. No longer does the university on the hill hold all the knowledge. It exists in multiple places. And so now the question becomes, how do we create those reciprocated relationships grounded in trust and understanding that can really make a difference? And as I mentioned before, and as we really feel very strongly in our work, and we just completed a study about this, which we'll tell you a little bit later when we push on this idea about reciprocated relationships in a second, is that the quality and the type of relationships that we really have are really important. So if we can build and create the conditions for deep, trusting relationships to occur, then we are more likely to take a chance with one another. So for example, if Karen and I have a deep, trusting relationship, which we do, I'm more likely to try things out and to be vulnerable with her, right? I'm more likely to experiment, to risk take, in a way that I know I'm safe with her. So what happens often is that people don't feel psychologically safe in the environments in which they do their work. And that's in part because of sanctions and fear and the pressure that Kara talked about at the beginning. So one question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we create the conditions for deep, trusting relationships to be part of our work? How do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with one another, to be open, to be human with one another in doing our important work?
Okay, so given all of these ideas, we think, of course, it's important to think about what does that mean for policy and practice right now? What are the next steps? The first one that is, I think, very clear throughout the book is this idea of capacity building has to happen for these kinds of relationships to take place, for people to understand both what kinds of evidence they're looking at, but also to have those connections to be able to make sense of them together. And right now in our system that's much more focused on compliance and accountability, there's not a lot of room for that to happen. So really a shift in how we think about building capacity at all levels of the system in the context of this accountability is really critical right now. Also, incentivizing collaborative work across the system. And so what we mean by that is there are examples that we have of how these partnerships exist, particularly around higher ed and district leaders, for example. And those are great, but they're few and far between. And one of the things that AERA, American Educational Research Association, is starting to push on is this idea. How do we make sure that these kinds of connections are happening? How can we develop a culture that allows researchers to understand that that's part of their practice that might not have been their orientation before. But this also means building relationships on the ground. How do policymakers connect more with district leaders to understand what's happening on the ground as policy is playing out? And I'm from New York State, and so we have a lot of challenges right now in that, where there's just not a lot of understanding of what's going on the ground that could inform policy and actually make it work much better. So as Alan suggested, this reciprocated relationships is critical. This is hard to do, though, because it does involve a change in our paradigm in terms of how we understand what we're learning from each other. So even though Alan and I have now been working together for 8 or 9 years, that's easy. You start to develop this kind of relationship. It doesn't happen right away. And there's a lot of distrust in the system. And that's part of the problem. Whether we're work in schools or in district central office, there's so much change that has to happen in terms of making people trust each other. That's going to be the starting point before they can actually sit down and look at evidence and say, okay, how can we make this better? So having ways that we actually incentivize this kind of building trust is hard. We have to figure out how to do it. And we also have to work on developing leaders who know how to do this in their systems, whether it's policy leaders or leaders on the ground in districts and in schools.
I think the other important part here is that we also have to be mindful that this suggests a completely different set of capacities that we have to be intentional about. So it's one thing to sort of say, okay, on Wednesday you're the 2nd grade, but on Thursday you're a professional learning community, go. Right? There are a host of skills and capacities necessary. Some of those are those technical elements. So please don't misinterpret that we're saying ignore the technical, only pay attention to the relational. We're not saying that. We're saying it's really critical to have the technical knowledge and skills. And you need the social capital, the social interactions to really make that happen. So it's both and. In education, I spent 16 years in public school practice before going to the university. So I lived in the world of public school practice. And I ducked my head as the phonics and the whole language debate took place. I ducked my head when we went from cooperative learning to individualized instruction, right? Because educators are like, this too will pass. Because this too will pass. So the question becomes, how do we move beyond these kind of separated either-or work and to try to think about work as both and. It's both the technical skills and it's the social capacities that are necessary. And I think this also likely suggests something different at the university level. As an academic, I don't think this is true for you either, and no disrespect to our institutions, they were wonderful, but as an academic, I wasn't trained in how to play well with others out in the field. I knew how to do that because I came from the world of practice. But that isn't the natural orientation, right? So how are we mindful at higher education about also building the capacities about the next generation of academics that are going to come out to do this work? How do we grow them up understanding that just the way that we do things is exactly as that story that Vivian shared at the very beginning? And more importantly, how do we help universities incentivize that kind of work when they often spend most of their time counting how many publications you have and where those publications take place?
And the one thing I'll add is that some of the greatest learning that Ellen and I have done is when we bring those charts and maps to the schools and the central office and say, what do you see? And then they start a conversation about what they see on those pictures that he was showing before. And that helps us to understand, because a lot of times we as researchers, of course, make assumptions about what we're seeing and what's going on in these places. Without that insider knowledge, we would be stuck at a certain place. But having that insider knowledge from them as they grapple with it allows us to then think differently about our own work. And I think that's one of the, back to the training, is we're not oriented to think that way necessarily in the training that we've had. And so it's developing a different type of skill.
I think this is such an important point here, because one of the things that we're really intentional about doing in our work is that the impulse is to come in and collect this data and give a list of recommendations. In fact, people readily ask us for this, like, tell us what to do, right? But the trick is to hold the sacred space to say, we're not going to do that. We're going to respect and honor your intelligence and your thoughtfulness, and we together are going to learn what this means, and we together will figure out what you're supposed to do with it. And holding that space, and I call it sacred space intentionally, because that is where the learning happens. That's the magic sauce, I think. And this is what I think accounts for what Vivian was talking about in Paul's work. It's that space that you can hold in which people can professionally develop, learn, grow, and create these kind of relationships we know are consequential for the work.
So as a result of that, we've developed new norms of reciprocal exchange. And we have done that in our own work, as we're suggesting, because we've developed that trusting relationship where they don't think we're coming in to give them all the answers. They understand that the research evidence that we bring is what we gathered from surveys and interviews and things from their community, but we're only part of the story. They're part of the story too. And so we've been able to develop this reciprocal exchange of ideas and practices, and that's hard. It's hard to develop that, and it's time-consuming. And as Alan's suggesting, that even though it's so critical, we don't tend to think about that piece when we're thinking about the work that we do. We also don't think about, not just the practice of doing that, but the idea that this is a goal we should have for the future, for leaders in higher ed, for leaders in different levels of the system. And so if that's our goal, then how do we think about the way that we prepare people? We have to then put it into place, whether it's in coursework or experiences or shadowing, whether it's in the mentoring that happens at the university level. And all of those things have to be supported by our policies and our structures that exist.
So the idea is, how do we bring together our human capital, right? Our knowledge, experiences, understanding, training, and our social capital, the power in our relationships, to actually generate this idea around intellectual capital, something that didn't exist before, right? Something that pushes our boundaries, something that creates opportunities for double loop learning to actually take place. And as we sort of bring this, all these big ideas with no charts and graphs to a close, let's just tap on a couple other things. So one of the things that's really wonderful about this partnership is that I've gotten to know Kara both as a person, as a professional, and as a fellow academic that's really passionate about the work. That's been really great for me personally. The other thing is that she's been influenced by some of my strange Californian ways. Hence, we have a slide up here with somebody doing yoga in the middle of this very peaceful lake. So you may be thinking to yourself, what could this possibly have to do with research evidence? We thought the same thing, but we just thought it was such a great image that we wanted to use it. And what we really came upon is it's this idea about being mindful and intentional about our work. This idea about mindfulness and compassion is really starting to come to the fore. At UC San Diego, we have a Center for Mindfulness. Stanford's got a Center for Mindfulness. This idea about being mindful, present, and intentional is incredibly important. Our work has really been a lot around leadership and also teachers, but the role of leadership in being mindful and intentional about their work is really important. And so as we look at developing and generating new policies, which will be something that we have to do, that's really important. But can we also be mindful and intentional about tweaking existing policies that don't undercut the opportunities for people to build relationships, to try stuff, to fail fast, to fail forward, and to redo and to redesign their own workplaces? How are we intentional and mindful about that? So in bringing this to close, we sort of selected this series of images. And And does anyone have any idea what this is an image of, by the way? That sounds rhetorical, but if you have an idea and you want to shout it out, I can't give you a book if you guess it right. Huh? Holy? Ah, right, okay. So it is a kind of a festival. Actually, what you're looking at here, I just came back from a Fulbright in Barcelona. So I always pick difficult places to travel to. So I came back from a Fulbright in Barcelona. And outside Barcelona, in little villages, they have these big festivals, you're absolutely right, and they build these things called human castles, which are really awesome. I'm going to show you one of those in a second. But as Kara and I were really thinking about this work, I kept pestering her. I'm like, oh, these things from Barcelona are so cool. We got to see how this is, because I think it's a metaphor for what we really believe in and what comes out across the chapters. So the first thing is we've got to think about this festival, this human castle attempt, as a system, as an interdependent and interconnected system. Let me make that more sort of concrete. So this is the foundation of one of these human castles. And what you see here is you see the connections and everyone's arms connecting with everybody else. And you cannot tell in that foundation who is the mayor, who is collecting the garbage, who's the teacher, who's the doctor. At that point in time, we all are connected and all have a common purpose. It takes about 700 people to make one of these castles. It'll be the big reveal in a moment. This is just the warm-up. It takes about 700 people to make one of these castles. And I interviewed some of the students that I was working with when I was on my visit, and I asked them, I said, okay, but is there really an important person in this? Like, where's the kind of keystone in this? And that to them was a completely crazy question, because there is no one keystone. The hands on my shoulders of somebody in front of me are just as important as the hands that are on my shoulders that are supporting me. Because when we think about this, this is about engendering cooperation among many, among us all, towards a common shared purpose. And when you can do that, you can do amazing things. This is one of these castles completed. So at the very end, what happens is a 4-year-old boy scampers up this sort of, this group of people, right? He scampers up this. This is any parents in the audience would have some level of freak out about this, I'm sure. But he scampers up. At the very end, he holds up 4 fingers, which represents the flag of the area. And it's a big, huge honor to be that kid. But I also asked the question, I'm like, okay, I'm afraid of heights. So like, what if I'm that kid and I freak? And I'm like really nervous and I freak out. Well, they have spare kids that are also ready to go, right? So in other words, there's redundancy in the system. We aren't solely responsible for one person, and when that person goes, oh well. There's redundancy in the system. And if that little boy or girl can't climb that tower and because they get too nervous or whatever, they're still part of the team, right? So even when we trip and we fall, we are still part of the team. So how do we create the conditions for that to really happen? How are we interconnected and interdependent in a deep system of trust and meaning and mindfulness to accomplish great things? At the end of the day, we're talking about research evidence, but really on a deeper level, we're talking about our ability to work and to be together and to push ourselves to places we didn't think were possible. And the moment we think, our book would suggest, is right now to do that work. So with that, we will say thank you. And Maria wanted to know if anyone wanted to volunteer to build a little castle up here. We're also.
Thank you both very much. Wow, this gives us a very interesting way to think about all of this stuff as we get started for our panel conversation. I'm going to bring everyone up here and get them settled, and then we can jump into some of the Q&A. Kara and Alan, you have given us so much to think about. It's going to be, I think, very interesting now to apply some of these ideas and hear from these folks about their experiences on the ground at both the federal level, the state level, the local level, to see how all of this actually plays out in their work. So I'd ask the panelists to please come up and take their seats. While they're doing that, I'm just going to pull out 2 more names for our drawing for our book, which now I know everyone wants to read after that presentation. So for you latecomers, your names are in here, so don't worry, you're all good. Okay. Brittany Beth. Are you here, wherever you are? Okay, you can stay. We'll bring it to you. Okay, let me get one more. Leslie Giamo. Yeah, well, there you go. Okay. All right. Good. Their names are in there. Thank you. Okay. Okay, now I am going to do very brief introductions because, as I'm sure many people have said to you, your bios are just too long and too impressive to go into detail. So I'll just move down the line and then we'll jump right into our questions here. At the far end of the list, Carmel Martin. Thank you, Carmel, for joining us. We really appreciate it. Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center of American Progress, Carl Cohn, Urban Leadership Program and Clinical Professor from the School of Educational Studies at Claremont McKenna. Claremont Graduate College. Faith Connolly, who's the Executive Director of the Baltimore Education Research Consortium. Vivian Seng, Vice President Programs, William T. Grant Foundation, and Sarah Sparks, reporter from EdWeek. So thank you all for joining us. I would be remiss, Faith, if I didn't say that we are all thinking about your town of Baltimore today and hoping that things continue to get better there. And thank you for joining us. I'm sure there's a lot going on at home, so I appreciate it. Okay, I have a lot of questions here, so I'm just going to sort of jump in with the one big question, and then I'll ask some specific questions about each one of your work as well, okay? So people often talk about the need to move research closer to practice, but one of the things that Vivian mentioned and Karen Allen talked about is this idea that that exchange should not be seen as a one-way street, that it really has to be a two-way enterprise. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit from all the different places where you sit, how you see that playing out, whether in your experience you've seen it work, what you think the challenges are, whatever nugget of that you want to jump into based on your experience. I just would like to hear you talk a little bit about that. And Carl, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you, please.
Sure. So I was a beginning superintendent in Long Beach. I was appointed 2 months after the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles, a very dicey time. We were getting money from the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation and their program officer, Hayes Mizell. We had an opening in our director of research position inside the school district, and he had become a critical friend, and he said to me, you know, maybe you should actually recruit someone who actually knows something about research and evaluation rather than just going with whoever inside the district is the next person who's supposed to get this. So we went to Eva Baker's shop at UCLA, the Kress Center, and hired a woman named Lynn Winters who came to the district and brought with her the resources of the Kress Center, which changed the dynamic inside the district in terms of our ability to work with others in partnership with regard to research. And so the Clark Foundation started giving us all of these opportunities, and thus was born the Long Beach Education Partnership, which has endured now for about 20 years, and you have the phenomena of a large urban system with only 2 superintendents in 23 years. And part of that is the ability to use research to influence what actually goes on in classrooms. But it doesn't always start necessarily with research. Sometimes it starts with results, good practice results, and then figuring out how do we bring this to larger scale inside the rest of the school district.
Faith, do you want to jump in and add something to that?
Yeah, so we're a local consortium in Baltimore. We've been around about 7 years. I've been there about 4.5. We're on our 3rd CEO and our 6th research office. So we are the institutional memory now of the district and the research office. The one thing we've noticed in going through our work is we'd originally thought of a dissemination model. We pushed out reports and briefs, and we met with staff to tell them, show our slides and tell them what we knew. We're really moving ourselves now. We're trying to go through a new strategic thinking about our communication, and we're going to conversations and discussion rather than presentations. But we're breaking our work down now in 2 different places. One is Mythbuster. We hear a lot of people say things that just aren't true, and it's research-based or it's this or that. So we see that as a huge role that we can play for the district. And the second part is Thought Partner. And we're doing this more and more. And it's, the way it rolls out into the field is when the district puts together a cross-functional work group, we're invited to sit to the table with them. People are in the middle of a conversation about something new. We get invited to the table to have that conversation with them. And it's these informal conversations where they have immediate feedback, right? That connection between what the research is and what I'm actually doing right now happens. Then we can discuss it in full if they have more questions about it, and we're there and capable to do that. And so that conversation can move forward a whole lot faster. This is just starting to take on a lot of speed and interest on the district part, and we're really kind of excited about it.
Anyone else want to jump in? Sorry.
First, I just want to thank Karen Allen for the terrific presentation. I'm very eager to read the book now. But the word reciprocal Allen used, and which I think gets to your point of two-way, really rang true for me. I think, you know, in seeing over the years very sincere efforts to infuse an evidentiary base into federal policy, it's been frustrating to see how horribly wrong that goes in terms of the translation from the federal to the state to the local to the building to the classroom level. And I think one of the reasons that it often goes wrong is because we haven't built a system where there is that reciprocity at the classroom, at the building level. And to me, the most important change that we could make to shift that sense of I mean, it's really a cultural shift that we need as much as anything else. But we need to, first of all, train teachers to be consumers of evidence and researchers in real time in their classrooms. But I think we have to change the way that we organize schools so that there's the room to do that. There's an opportunity to build the collaborative relationships that Karen Allen described. And we have to train them. We really have to completely revamp teacher preparation. It to me is the biggest takeaway. Is if we don't create the system at that level, it kind of doesn't matter what happens at the federal level, and it doesn't matter what happens at the building level. And you know, I've been a long time proponent of looking at other professions and seeing how they do that and try to replicate that. I think we need more organizations like Faith's. That was hugely. There was one in Chicago, that was hugely influential to Arne Duncan when we first came into office, because he had seen the power of that, you know, sort of in real-time use of data and consuming it and changing your behavior based on it and looking at seeing how it worked. So that part of the presentation just really was very impactful for me, and I think there's lots of policy implications for that, which we tried to tackle in the Obama administration, but there's obviously lots more that needs to be done.
I want to just touch on this for one sec. This idea that Karen Allen talked about really struck me as so interesting, and I was thinking about it in terms of as one who sits in the federal role, but also one who's worked on the Hill as well. This idea of the vulnerability and the trust versus the accountability, and the social interactions versus the technical capabilities. I mean, these contrasting things and how important it is that they interweave together. From your experiences, I mean, is that a pipe dream? I mean, like, is there a way to come closer to that? I agree completely with the idea that professional development and teacher training is a huge part of that, but that's got to be so difficult to manage at that high level.
Yeah, I don't think you can manage it at that level. I think what the federal and state level should be focusing on is how to build an infrastructure that allows for that to happen, and that takes investments, particularly given the way our schools are currently operating. It would take investments to change change them so they're operating differently. For example, like our teachers spend so much more time. I know this is like a data point that's a little bit in debate, but I think it's pretty clear our teachers spend way more time in front of students teaching them than their peers internationally from countries with better outcomes than the United States. In order to give teachers more space to collaborate, to consume data, to work together to figure out what's working and what's not, we need to give them more time in the day to do that. So I think that's where policy can come in. I think to your point about the tension with accountability, I think that's real. I think obviously No Child Left Behind went too far in terms of that. I would argue that it was less that less that the consequences were dire, but there wasn't enough attention paid to how to build an infrastructure. I mean, if you read the statute of No Child Left Behind, it contemplated that well before consequences came in, school leaders would develop improvement plans based on evidence and create, and I think the architects of No Child Left Behind contemplated that there would be a continuous improvement model, but we didn't do enough to figure out how to build the capacity and the infrastructure to see that happen. And you saw a fairly bureaucratic system just focus on the consequences as opposed to the continuous improvement part of the equation. But I think you see school systems across the country trying to get that balance right and not abandoning accountability, not abandoning the concept that if a school is in the bottom 5% of performance in the entire state, that something fairly drastic needs to happen, but trying to, before you get to that, focusing more on how to build a system of continuous improvement, less emphasis on test scores as the be-all and end-all of whether a school is a good school or a bad school, greater focus on leading indicators so you could capture failure before it happens, address failure before it becomes too extreme. So I do think that's a very real problem that we need to deal with, is how to get that balance right. But I think there's a way to do it.
Can I add?
Yeah, please.
So I'm sorry, Claude. One thing I would add is, and again, I'm going back to Karen Allen's talk, is as we think about accountability, that it doesn't somehow unintentionally do more harm. For example, I would say that, they showed us those maps of how folks are interrelated, and there are certain key people, the big black triangles, who do quite a bit of connecting and getting research evidence out there to their peers. In accountability systems, we can also disrupt all of that, right? There's a lot of shuffling. We can end up creating a lot of churn that ends up disrupting, even in the places where it does exist. It doesn't exist in enough places where there are strong connectors. Those people can be pushed out, moved on, and then the whole system, the social system, becomes disrupted. And so then the sanctions that come down through accountability can actually further disrupt the system and kind of bring down the level of the sort of the relationships and, even how tenuous it was, trust that existed to begin with. So at first, perhaps do no harm, right, in terms of that.
I was just going to say some of the superintendent preparation programs that I've been involved in, both the Harvard Urban Superintendent's Program and the Rhodes Superintendent's Academy. As I was watching the presentation, I was thinking, okay, how would this presentation fit with what I saw in both the Broad and the Harvard programs? And I think the line of research is incredibly important. But I can't remember a time where there was a presentation on the importance of building relationships and the social networks. It was all about bringing a sense of urgency to a failing system. And what is your theory of action for change? What is your 90-day plan to get at this? And none of it included the types of things that Kara and Alan are talking about, which I think are really important. And so part of what needs to be done is some sort of discussion with those who advance programs, superintendent preparation programs, other leadership programs around these issues. One of the things that's really interesting about the Long Beach experience, so I was there for 10 years, the really big gains in student performance didn't kick in until years 5 through 10. And when I look at where we've been in the last decade and a half in terms of Race to the Top, No Child Left Behind, who gets that kind of time in an urban setting? It's pretty much a 4-year election cycle, and if you haven't moved the needle, then we're starting to look elsewhere for leadership. So I think this is a really critical problem.
Sarah, I'm going to ask you to jump in here with your overarching view of this as a reporter who's been covering it. Faith, will you jump in right after?
Okay, sorry. Well, I think it's really interesting that, I mean, we're all in education, and I'm guessing most of us are familiar with research or we wouldn't be here. And what's one of the sort of keystone pieces of education research that we see proven over and over again? The relationship matters to learning. It could be the teacher and a student. It could be the principal inspiring their teachers. Why did we think it was going to be different with schools relating to researchers who want to come in and potentially ask them to learn something new or try something new? That's something we've seen proven in the research over and over again. And if we're talking about making it more useful, the fact that we need to actually look at our own research and use it ourselves might be telling. I've seen a lot. I've been covering education research for a decade now, in Education Week for several years and other publications before that, and in both geographic local newspapers and here in DC. And I do see more of an effort right now to get these long-term partnerships going, as well as a number of very long-standing partnerships like Long Beach, like Baltimore, like the Chicago Consortium, which is turning 25. And because of their long-standing, you're getting more attention to what they've done and more examination of what they've accomplished, which hopefully one would hope would make it more likely that people will say, hey, maybe we do need more than 4-year flips. But I also think there's the relevance conversation keeps coming up, but it comes up in different avatars each time. I mean, if you think about No Child Left Behind, and also the creation of IES under the Education Sciences Reform Act, which is now being reauthorized. They were looking at, we need experimental design, we need gold standard research, we need really high quality. And what was that about? That was about we need it to be more usable. It can't be usable if it's not high quality. So we need it to actually, at the end of the day, say yes or no, did this work, did this not work? Well, so we did that, and there was a lot more quantitative research, a lot more randomized control trials. And then at the end of all these randomized control trials, the practitioners said, okay, so this means that this works and we should do that? And everybody got from finding what works to finding out it doesn't work here. You know, it works there, but it only works within this very specific context and we have no way to scale it. So then we come back to talking about relevance again, and that means, oh, we need more context, we need more implementation studies, we need more. And I think having that sort of give and take and the relationship might help researchers think a little bit more about training themselves, and reporters and other information brokers think more about training themselves in how to think about these things, how to ask the right questions and engage with the people that you're trying to help, rather than constantly talking about how do we train teachers to use our research? How do we train teachers to understand that our way is the best? You know?
Faith, I know you want to jump in here.
Yeah, sure, slightly different context now, but the underlying everything we're talking about trust and people understanding is I'm hearing accountability and fixing things in the bottom people, bottom schools, the bottom districts. The word that we're starting to use is power dynamic. So I realize when I come in to present my findings to a group, there's a power dynamic. If instead I'm sitting at a cross-functional group, it's a very different power dynamic. So as we're establishing trust, we're starting to have a very explicit conversation about what's the power dynamic that exists. Because one of the things we've found in Baltimore, not surprisingly now, is that a lot of our parents are completely disenfranchised from the system and from the schools. How do we get information to them? They do not trust the schools. How do we help them think about that? And I'm coming from a power dynamic of an institution in Baltimore. So we're trying to think through how do I get through intermediaries who are trusted brokers who don't have that power dynamic and leverage the information out in a very different way. But I think it's an important thing to talk about when you're talking about policy. It generally flows down, and there's a dynamic there that you have to address.
So I want to ask you a question. It's actually a perfect build-in. I love that idea of power dynamic. When I'm at home with my family tonight, I'm sure I'll be thinking about it. But I was thinking, like, okay, so beyond trust. So you're working with, practitioners on the ground. They bring their own resources, their own talent, their own experiences to the table. And you're working with researchers. You've established trust, but are there really the mechanisms in place to make sure that those people who are working in schools can also bring what they have to offer to the table? Again, I'm going back to this two-way street mentality. It's not just about trusting and accepting what the researchers have to offer, to your point, Sarah, but it's also about being acknowledged for the fact that you have something to offer as well. I think that's both difficult at the local level, and I see it even as I worked at the federal level. Carmel, I don't know if you felt this way as well. Sometimes it's very hard to sort of access what the impact of federal and state policy, is going to be at people on the ground when you're at that level. You want to sort of hear what they have to say as well. So, Carl, can you talk a little bit about your ability to manage that and sort of make that more operational in the school districts you worked at?
A great applause line in any superintendent's speech is reform is going to be both bottom up and top down in Long Beach. And everybody goes, oh, okay, yeah, we see all the top down. Where's the evidence for the bottom up? We had this teacher at a single elementary school. His name was Cy Swan. All of a sudden we noticed that his students, especially the EL students, were absolutely doing extremely well on the state mathematics test. And so, you first rule out cheating, and then you dig in and find out what's going on in that classroom. And so what we did with his approach, we then piloted it in several schools in the district, and then later on adopted it as the math curriculum for the entire district, proof that reform could be bottom up. What was interesting about this, several years later, here comes the McKinsey researchers who are doing a study of school systems that have gotten better in America and elsewhere over the past decade and a half. They really dug in with Cy Swan and went out there and asked him, where did you come up with these techniques? And it turns out he got them from his aunt in Singapore. And so the whole issue of how bottom up someone in an individual classroom in a large urban district, and now Swan Math is the curriculum for 3 or 4 large urban districts in California. But an example of how there is legitimacy for a practitioner in a real classroom in a real district, and how you bring that to scale.
Vivian, I want to ask you a question specifically
Can
about
I
the role.
answer this question?
Oh,
too?
yeah, absolutely.
So one thing that could be helpful, what we've learned from these different partnerships is the ground rules that they set up. Who is going to have the final say in what and have the power to make these decisions? So I'll give you an example. SERP, which is based here in DC, they set some ground rules between SERP as sort of a coordinating body, the researchers will do the work, and the district. And they're going to try and work together to figure out what the research agenda is. But at the end of the day, the districts have the final say in what is the important question, what is the important problem we're going to try to solve. At the end of the day, the researchers have the final say in what is the research design and methods we're going to use to try to solve that. Now, SERP as a coordinating body does work across different districts, so they have to ensure that the work that they agree to do is going to have relevance to other districts that they work with across the country. So I think being clear about what some of the ground rules are and who's going to play what role, because you can't all come to the table and have a big, hot mess, right? But I think sometimes defining some of those roles can be quite helpful.
Okay, so I'm going to build on that because one of the things I'm interested in is this idea of the role of foundations and other groups play, and I'm not talking about intermediary organizations, we're going to get to that next, but the role of sort of outside players in promoting the use of research-based evidence in communities. And you can address that question directly or perhaps talk about your own experience. Faith, if you can start please in Baltimore, what are some of the groups that maybe have been particularly helpful in your community in allowing this to happen?
So Burke has an interesting history in that our original funders were local foundations who wanted to know the truth about what was going on in Baltimore City schools. So it was sort of begun as this independent voice that would sort of explain what was happening. Over time, we have been able to get involved in a number of sort of community-oriented work. So we are part of Baltimore's Promise, which is sort of like a Strive in Cincinnati that's looking at work through K-12. We're part of the grade level reading campaign where we're working with the community to talk about tutoring and working with principals on work. So I would say it's something that has grown organically. It's grown as people have realized who we are in the work that we do, and it's grown as we have a track record for trust and the way that we do our work.
Anyone else want to jump in? Carl, I know you had mentioned the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation.
Yeah, we couldn't have done it without foundation support. So it was Edna McConnell Clark, it was the Knight Foundation, it was Arthur Vining Davis. And the interesting thing about Long Beach is that most of the reforms focused on the classroom. And this idea of spending time building trust really was important, both inside the school system and with the partnership. When the partnership actually started, I was probably chief skeptic. We used to refer to Cal State Long Beach as the mausoleum on the hill. And so the idea that they would bring considerable help to what we were doing, I was skeptical, but I remember we were planning one of the very first events, and it was going to be after teachers had taught all day. We were going to feed them, and then Katie Haycock of Ed Trust was going to give a little talk, and the planner said, well, what will we do after the talk? And I said, my God, you let them go home. They've taught, they're listening. And it turns out I was dead wrong. Teachers across the levels, K-12, community college, four-year institutions, they wanted to be together to talk about what they could do to create this so-called seamless education system. But I actually started out skeptical about building this relationship.
I would say foundations can play various roles, right? I think one consideration that's important to think about in the beginning is what is the goal of the research? I mean, today I think we're talking a lot about the goal of research to fuel learning in the system to help it get better. But in many cases, research is used to support a reform idea or a policy idea that people already have. I'm already convinced that this is what we should do, and I'm going to marshal research in support of it. And so in this time of strategic philanthropy, where foundations increasingly are trying to focus on what the reform agenda is that they support, research can also become a part of that, right? So research is funded, supported, disseminated, promoted in order to further a particular reform agenda. On the one hand, that makes it more powerful because then research is feeding into a particular sort of stream of reform. On the other hand, it can also create quite a bit of cynicism because it's, well, you have your research and I have my research, and I pretty much know what your research is going to tell me, right? And so that can create some disruption of people trusting research and being able to use it to learn and decide what to do.
So my question, excuse me, builds on that. When we're talking about intermediate organizations, we know that these groups can play an enormous amount of value, as Karen and Alan talked about. But when you're in Washington, I think one of the things that you sort of learn to be careful of is the notion of an intermediary group, and whether that intermediary group is, as to your point, Vivian, focused more on advocacy or driving their point, as opposed to enabling true research to feed the policy or practice, whatever the end goal is. Is there a danger that lying there, or is there a concern there about really understanding the difference between research evidence versus research that is being used to drive an advocacy point? I think sometimes there can be confusion, and this is, I think, a Washington concern, probably more than those who work outside of Washington. Yeah, it would be interesting to hear you talk about that. But I do think that conversation is an important one. I'd just like to know your thoughts on that. Faith, why don't you start?
Sure. So this is something I have to take really seriously. The moment I think I cross into that advocacy line and I'm perceived to be an advocate and not an empiricist looking at research, I don't think I'll get funded anymore. I think my local funders will say, you've flipped the switch, I can't trust you anymore. So for me, it's a really, really important line. And when I started at Berk, actually, we had a lot of conversations about whether or not we were going to make recommendations and reports. We ended up saying yes because we understood the research best. We should make recommendations, but if someone wants to tweak them, that's fine. But that line to us is really, really important.
Anyone else want to comment?
I mean, I think it is an important line to draw. I guess as a lawyer and someone who's worked in public policy most of my career, I don't think it's a bad thing that advocates use evidence in making arguments. I mean, I get the point that as a good lawyer, I could probably muster an argument on either side of any case. That's what they train you to do, right? But I think it's a good thing that people in the public policy circles are pointing to evidence, pointing to research, and I think it's just a question of, again, getting the balance right in terms of level of prescriptiveness from federal or state or even local policy to practice, but driving people towards the evidence, I think, is a healthy and positive thing.
Right. Well, promoting this idea of a broader definition, of what people can use.
It does. I mean, I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective because I'm trying to decide whether to use someone's research or not. And obviously there are advocacy groups that do very, very good research. But you do come at it with a lot more skepticism when, as you mentioned, I know I have an 80% likelihood of knowing exactly what this person is going to find before they've actually found it. And sometimes that might be on the basis of what the group's mission statement is, or what topics within an area, what questions they're asking. So sometimes it's not so much that a think tank or an advocacy group is being methodologically unsound. But if you ask the question this way, you're going to get this kind of answer, and this way, you're likely to get that kind of answer. And that makes it a little sketchier.
I think what I hear districts saying they really want is, and this is my interpretation, are honest brokers of research evidence. Because, you know, in this evidence-based era, lots of folks are selling them things as evidence-based. So they're almost barraged with this, right? Evidence this, evidence that. And I think what they need is at least some space, because I think policy advocates are always going to do this, and it's a natural part of our democracy, right, to bring forth evidence to support your place. But I think there's also needs to maintain a space for honest brokers who are not trying to sell a particular format, but are trying to genuinely understand, here's the problem that you have, and what's the research evidence that can inform you in making that decision. And I think actually ESRA, the Education Sciences Reform Act, really did quite a good job with that with IES, setting up IES to be an honest broker of research evidence that was not going to generate certain kinds of research evidence depending on the politics. And hopefully in the reauthorization of ESRA, that sort of honest broker role will remain.
There was a point in Long Beach where the notion of exposing poor kids of color to veteran teachers with credentials and experience would dramatically improve student performance. And so I said, you know, if involuntary transfer of teachers, which is a real wedge issue inside a school district, if that's where we need to go, I want to know first whether or not that's the case. So we bus 20,000 students in Long Beach, basically poor kids of color, to other neighborhoods where they're exposed to veteran teachers with credentials and experience. So let's look at our own experience. So we conducted that study, and it turned out that there didn't appear to be any benefit to poor kids of color with this exposure to these veteran teachers. Obviously, there were other variables going on. These were in more suburban parts of the district. But what was interesting about this line of research, and Kiyo Yamashiro, who was working in Long Beach at the time, was one of the investigators, how much the research community wanted to sort of suppress this information, that this exposure to veteran teachers with credentials didn't have the effect that the research community had long held was present. And I was sort of taken aback by that. I was sort of, well, you know, research is research and let's get it out there. But there was this sort of pushback from AERA and other places about, oh no, don't go there. That stands things on its head.
I'm going to tell the folks in the audience to get their questions ready, and I think we have mics for people. Is that correct? Yes, we do. And then I'm going to circle back and ask some questions about the federal roles. Since we are in Washington, we have to ask those questions. But first, let's see, listen and see if some folks from the audience have some questions. Anyone have a question for the panel? Mike? Yeah? I think we got a mic for Mike coming your way.
Mike needs a mic. I'm Mike Usdam from the Institute for Education Leadership. Hi, Carl. I'm sitting here in the geriatric section of the room, and essentially we've all lived through these cycles of reform, top-down, bottom-up, et cetera, et cetera. And I was very much smitten with the presentation. I think it's terrific. You guys are doing the Lord's work. But somehow or other, I guess maybe age makes you skeptical because there seem to be such tremendous deterrents. And I'd like to ask the panel to address two of the major deterrents to this very significant agenda. One is the reward system in higher ed. Are they going to permit bright, talented young professors to spend the time in school systems so they basically can build the relationships of trust and responsibility. I don't see the reward system in schools of education making that transformation. Secondly, I'd like to ask Carl, in terms of the major deterrent in our governance system, whether it's the Secretary of Education, the Chief State School Officers, the school superintendents, this leadership churn of basically these results taking 5 or 10 years, for you to comment, Carl, on how significant it was that you were indigenous to the Long Beach system, you knew where the skeletons were, and you weren't parachuted in as a messiah to last for 2 or 3 years. Until we pay attention to this leadership churn of school boards as well as superintendents, the average tenure of a chief state school officer, I think, is 2 or 3 years. And to me, this governance breakdown, if you will, is just a deterrent, again, to the Lord's work.
Right.
I didn't mean to give a speech.
No. I grew up in that system and then went away for 4 years and then came back. And someone said about me when I was first appointed, this is a very dangerous individual. He's an insider with an outsider's perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think what we were able to do without the research that's available today, we valued these relationships and spent a lot of time. Cookies with Carl. I visited schools with each of the presidents. I had 3 presidents of the teachers union over a 10-year period, and all of that time we visited the schools together to listen to teachers, which became incredibly important. Great run in Long Beach, not so successful in San Diego, but part of the issue was Long Beach gave me the time to build relationships, and going down to San Diego was all about, you know, what are you going to do to reverse the direction of the previous superintendent and that kind of churn. What was fascinating about being in Chicago and going to the presentation on 25 years of this research partnership, Barbara Bird Bennett was basically going on leave, and they mentioned that they've had 5 CEOs in the past 6 years or so in a place like Chicago. So the type of churn that Michael's talking about, we've got to get at that, and we've got to address that.
I kind of agree to a certain extent with his answer of like, no, you aren't necessarily going to get the higher education reward system set up. But I think this is a good point, that if you look at the folks who are doing more partnerships and long-term research projects, they are city-based or a particular topic of interest based. They're not necessarily university based, though sometimes they are affiliated, but they have some goal and some objective that they are measuring themselves against that's not publication and tenure. And they're getting evaluated by the people who evaluate them on how they're meeting that. And I think maybe that's the direction to seek some kind of detente on that.
I think both of your points are really important. I think they're both huge challenges for how we change the culture in education. I'm not sure how to crack the nut on the leadership change, but on the post-secondary institutions' role in this space, I think it's not just how do you create a culture that allows for researchers like the 2 we have here today to be closer to practitioners and be able to translate what they're doing to practitioners, but it's also how do we train teachers just K-12 teachers to be consumers of research and evidence and data so you can create that continuous improvement cycle. I mean, I think part of the problem is that post-secondary institutions that train teachers, they see their prospective college students as their customer. They don't see either their investors, and I would argue that the federal government is a huge investor in the space. Their model wouldn't work without federal aid. Nor do they see the school districts who are the employers of their graduates as their customers. So when we've thought about this at CAP and in my other roles as policy advisor to members of Congress and on the Hill, we've tried to figure out, well, where are the levers for change so that we can ask them to be more responsive to either or both of those groups. The other lever for change is to get the prospective student to demand that they prepare them in the way they need to be prepared. So I think one way to do that is to get those people data that shows which of those programs tend to produce more effective teachers versus less effective teachers, which I think you see at the heart of the Obama administration's teacher prep regulations. At CAP, we have a proposal that's focused on creation of residency programs. So don't think we're going to have a sea change in every post-secondary institution overnight, but if we could build up residency programs, which probably require third-party intermediaries to be in the space, where you're basically giving federal funding to a post-secondary institution to build a program that's built on this culture of, connecting researchers to practitioners, but also training teachers to be consumers of evidence and data and be in a mindset of continuous improvement once they get into the classroom. That requires investing in the creation of lab schools. It also requires that post-secondary institutions allow that a big part of the prospective teacher's education is going to be done in classrooms with kids and not in post-secondary institutions. So our stab at this problem is to call for, which we have done, federal funding for the creation of those kinds of programs at institutions willing to do it. And we see institutions across the country doing it. They're doing it at Johns Hopkins, doing it at Maryland. So I don't know if it's the answer, but that's one of the strategies that we think could help.
I was just going to add that on the churn piece, it's even worse, I guess, than you might think if you're just thinking about superintendents. Alan and I have, our study with W.T. Grant Foundation was a longitudinal study in districts looking at all of the principals and central office leaders as they tried to reform and improve under sanctions. And so we could follow people over time who went in and see who went in and out of the system. And there's not really good data on this in terms of, we see a lot around the superintendents, but we were looking at all the leaders. And in these districts we were in, we had about 35 to 45% of the people left during the time. They were going in and out. This whole, the idea that change could happen when there were so many people in these critical positions going in and out of the system is something we don't think a lot about. And so we actually wrote a blog on this for the Shanker Institute because we think that this idea that if these weren't people just moving around within the system, they were actually moving out of principal roles and out of central office roles, and then new people coming in. And so on down the line, you ended up with a bifurcation in the system. How does change happen when you have people who aren't even connected at all?
Yeah, to build on that, I think we're also trying to push on this idea about expanding the capital cost of churn, right? So we can think about the fiscal aspect of it, right? Like, it costs a lot of money to train somebody up when they come in. We could think about the human capital loss, like you lose knowledge and organizational memory in a system. But the third element was the social capital cost. And so you've got these different capitals that are actually quite costly, each in its own really detrimental way. If you can remember the graph we showed you earlier with the black diamonds and the colored clusters, it turned out that over time, about 65% of those area superintendents left, effectively making those clusters of principals completely disconnected from the larger system, forcing them to sort of go underground and create their own kind of quote-unquote shadow system to get the work done. And so I think when we're talking about this idea about churn, we typically think about the cost or we think about the human capital, but there's an extreme social cost to this as well. And I think that that's something we want to try to keep really front and center in our work.
I'm going to let some folks ask some more questions here, because I think we can talk about this forever. Yes, Mike, excellent question, by the way. Well done. Josh?
Hi, Josh Glazer from GW. I wanted to pick up on the comment that Mike asked and some of the responses. Great presentations and great topic, and I'm very interested in it and have been thinking about it for a while. One thing that's been sort of bothering me in this field, or nagging at me a bit, is the assumption that really research institutions and researchers are actually the right partners for districts. I just sort of worry about that a little, because it just seems there's a lot of ways in which there's a bit of a misalignment. For example, that was a very good point that Mike made, that the incentives for researchers, the absolute clear institutional incentives, are to do research, single author research, and to do rigorous research, which almost by definition means that you're going to be looking at very discrete problems. That is incongruous with the knowledge that complex systems need. They desperately need integrated and coordinated knowledge and understandings and insights that cut across all the subdomains that comprise academic research: leadership, pedagogy, professional development, data use, special ed. These things, to be effective in complex systems, have to be integrated. There's something ironic about a school of education coming and saying, we're going to talk to a district about integration because we have to be the most least integrated institutions in the world. Another thing on the same note that sort of troubles me a little bit is we're not there enough. We get there. I'm doing research now in Tennessee, trying very hard to be helpful to the district and the folks out there, meeting with them, talking to them. I just can't get there enough. I can be there enough to write the articles 4 times a year, 5 times a year, 6 times a year, but to be really helpful to the people on the ground, that's nothing. It's just not enough. You need to be there sort of all the time. I compare this is a little bit of a leap and then I'll stop talking, but I compare this in my mind, sort of thinking about researchers and research institutions, to some of these intermediary organizations. I'm going to give you just one brief example. Some of the more really forward-thinking charter management organizations, such as Aspire or Achievement First, if you look inside those organizations, they're not researchers, but there is a way in which they are integrating and bringing to bear different domains of knowledge, which is so much more commensurate and so much more aligned with the actual work of school improvement than what you would see in a school of ed, where maybe we have folks doing all these little different pieces of work, but we have no mechanism to bring them together, to coordinate them. There's like a coordination crisis here. I have a feeling in the Long Beach story, Carl is doing so much of the work of coordination and created such a coordinated and integrated system that there was actually, that he created a context in which the research could be very useful. But part of me, as I hear Carl talk, thinks this is the exception that proves the rule.
Okay, you've asked a lot of questions in that big mauler of a question. So who wants to jump in? Excellent question. Let's see if we can jump in and tackle it.
A couple things about Long Beach. In reflecting on it and looking back on it, I think the idea of working with Cal State Long Beach, a second tier, not an R1 university, was probably helpful. They were not as stuck on U.S. News and World Report rankings as a USC or UCLA might have been. So that's number one. The other thing, the president of the university at the time, Bob Maxim, said, to his credit, improving the K-12 system is a university-wide responsibility. It's not just the purview of the College of Education, which opened up math and science and a whole host of things that we wouldn't normally think about. So I think those are a couple aspects of the Long Beach situation that make it unique.
there was a good model that the Council of Great City Schools did, where they have a urban research fellowship where they embed their researchers a couple of days a week in different school systems, and there's been some really neat stuff going on. I know University of Wisconsin-Madison has some folks in, or had a couple years back. And I think you could try a model like that, but again, that was a partnership with the university, but I think it was being driven by a fellowship from an education organization.
We're going to try. First of all, thank you for your comment. I feel like you were singing our song, so thank you for singing that song. We're gonna try an experiment. So we're starting a new PhD program, and we're going to do it a place-based program, meaning we're going to partner up with a district in San Diego and try to think about this as a regional issue, where we have doctoral students, student teachers, our undergraduate folks that are doing some tutoring in classroom, all centered inside of a district, with the district posing the questions that the PhD students will then undertake as their dissertations, working together as teams. So it was a way to sort of think about how do we intersect all of these different, often discrete, siloed aspects in a place. But it took us looking outside to be able to do that inside effectively, right? And so I think this kind of how are we mindful and thoughtful about that is a really important part to this.
I guess we've spent quite a bit of time lately working and thinking about how to make sure that cognitive science is more integrated into education. It's kind of mind-boggling how little role brain science plays in education practice. And so I've been hanging out quite a bit with cognitive scientists, and we've together lamented the lack of connection there. So I guess I hear what you're saying, but I guess I would argue that we need more, not less, integration of basic science, which does by definition require that you get very regimented and not integrated in your approach, that we need more, not less of that in the education context. And I think what it takes is what Carl was saying, is that the university as a whole has to own teacher preparation, which means the cognitive scientists need to be spending a ton more time with the professors in the schools of education so that they can teach the teachers how to integrate cognitive science into practice, but also how to be consumers of evidence and research. So I think you need both things, which makes me a little bit nervous about the idea that we shouldn't have UCLAs of the world in the space, because I think we need them from that angle. It's just that we need both. Just like in medicine, there are people who do basic research and they are far from patients, but they have a heavy influence, and there's this whole system built up so that when doctors are trained, and they're trained as lifelong, they have lifelong learning in a way I don't think the education system has, but there's a high premium put on that. There's huge investments in that, but then there's also huge investments in structuring medical schools so that there's more applied learning happening instead of just sitting in the classroom and hearing theory in a disjunctured way. So I think that the post-secondary system has to tackle both aspects of that.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Stacy Skolsky from the National Association of School Psychologists. In listening to your ideas, I'm wondering if you could speak to how some of these concepts could be applied in rural settings. A lot of what you've addressed is sort of issues particular to urban settings, I think, where they have access to universities, where perhaps there isn't as many dual role relationships that influence some of these things. I'm just curious if any of this has been investigated in more rural communities and considering the outcomes of kids in rural settings. I think it has a lot of application, but I'm curious what kinds of things you think would be most successful there.
So 2 thoughts. One is that Kenji Hakuda at Stanford University has been bringing together different rural districts in California. And there's value just in bringing the rural districts together, right? Because these are very small districts with just a couple of staff. You know, we're not talking about big organizations. And then the researchers come in as a facilitator to bring them together, but then also then to help bring research to the table to meet their needs. And then that is, and then you have the regional education labs. And I think with the federal contract that required the labs to also work through these partnerships, what they're calling research alliances, you also see the emergence of these alliances that spread across different rural areas. And then the labs are trying to bring research and evidence to the table to help foster improvement. So I think there's a couple of models we can look at. I don't know that we have any, we don't have enough time, hasn't come by for us to see what the success is, but certainly these things are emerging.
So I'm going to exercise last privilege and ask a question about the federal role because I want to leave enough time because I know Adam Gamerman from the Foundation is going to make some closing remarks for us. So I'm going to condense some of my federal questions into one. So this White House has spent a good amount of time and energy in focusing on what I would say is like a what works agenda, evidence-based policy making. One of my colleagues pointed out that No Child Left Behind mentioned research over 110 times within various parts of the statute, which I found fascinating, but that the latest round of reauthorization drafts barely mention research at all. So I guess my big question is, what does this all mean? What, in your opinion, is this a bad thing? Is this nothing? And looking at the scope of how we've been thinking about supporting research and evidence at the federal level, what do we think in terms of where we are now and where we are moving forward? Whoever raises first gets
I think it was one of my primary, I was held accountable in No Child Left Behind for making sure those 100 and some references got put into the statute because of the senator that I worked for at the time. And my staff tells me, Maria, that in the current drafts it's more in the 30 to 40 range. I haven't actually checked myself. That's still fair. That's not bad. I mean, I guess I would say some could argue that it was just trying to not be so extreme. But I do think there is I think the reason you see a lessening of that in the current draft is because the philosophy of the leadership in the Congress, which is we should pull back in terms of federal role, in terms of prescribing a research base. That said, one of the amendments that passed in the markup was authorization for effectively what is I3, which is a program that's based on the concept of using research-based evidence in deciding what to fund. So I do think that there is compared to the debate in 2000, I think there is a growing acceptance that we need to have a focus on what works. I think what the Obama administration tried to do, and I'm sure lots of people would disagree with this, is in many of our policies, instead of prescribing the intervention, so prescribing private tutoring if a school is failing, we tried to invest in what we considered the infrastructure that was needed for people at the building level to be consumers of evidence and make the decisions for themselves. Now, there's definitely areas where people could rightly argue that we got overly prescriptive, but I think that was our theory of action. That was a theory of action for Race to the Top, that what we needed was systemic changes around a common definition of what kids need to know, standards, college and career ready standards. There was a need for huge investments in longitudinal data systems, because if we didn't have data systems, it would be really hard to judge at the school level, at the classroom level, what was working and what wasn't. So there's a big investment in that. And then there was a recognition that we needed to ensure that the workforce was prepared for the task at hand, which was to be consumers of evidence and figure out how to adjust their instruction in real time to meet the needs of their students. So that's why we had to focus on teacher evaluation systems. So I think to the extent moving forward, it's again, there were some areas where both No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top was overly prescriptive, so we have to get the balance right. But I do think there's a growing recognition that what the federal government can do is help build the infrastructure at the systemic level, as opposed to saying, no, you all must do class size reduction. Whether in 8th grade in your school, that only means you get from 30 kids to 28 kids. That's what this money's for, so that's what you're going to use it for. which was an evidence-based policy, but on the ground it just went awry because it didn't give enough power at the local level to figure out what made the most sense. So I think that that's the challenge for policymakers moving forward, is continuing the federal role to promote evidence and research and applying that to their investments, but doing it in a way that does no harm and hopefully does some good.
Sarah?
I think I agree with everything you're saying. I think there's also a branding issue to a certain extent, since there was a research community and to a certain extent a larger education community argument back and forth over what constituted scientifically based research versus evidence-based research, and one would hope that research would in general be both. So I got at least some of the sense that maybe toning down the particular language that had been used was partly just a branding issue. But I think it's an interesting change in approach between going at trying to get research use and evidence use from a legislative perspective and going this route of the OMB memos about how you fund projects, how you fund all grants, how the evidence required and the grants being rewritten between NSF and IES and them having collaborated on their evidence standards. So going in this sort of quiet, the way that you aren't going to get a lot of argument on the floor about this, that, or the other, and you aren't going to get a lot of commentators on it, but at the more technical level, when people are funding this program or that program, or submitting this research proposal for a grant, having it embedded into that, I think, is an interesting approach. And you see a lot more of that now in the Obama administration's approach to this than you did in previous administrations, I think.
Coming off 4 years on the California State Board of Education, I don't think it's going to make much difference. I think states are in revolt. We're defining our own future independent of where the feds have been, without calling a press conference and saying we're in revolt. But I think
Jerry Brown has done that.
I think we like to say we have a Jesuit Pope and a Jesuit governor in California. So we're carving out what you may have heard: LCFF, LCAP, local control funding formula, local control accountability plan. I don't know if we have time, but I'd be really interested in our researchers, because I think it's really important, this issue of social networks. We're sort of positing that compensatory investments in poor kids, English learners, and kids in foster care will realize gains in student achievement, but it seems like your research adds a layer that will be critically important to our implementation.
I would just add that going forward, as we think about the sort of the long game in this evidence-based movement, because I do agree we've made some substantial progress. But if we're thinking about but what we see right now, I think, is quite a lot of backlash. And the backlash is coming from very interesting places, right? And it's not just a right-left thing. And I think part of maybe the lesson we've learned in this near-term period is that we haven't fully engaged the folks sort of on the ground, right, in defining the research agenda and thinking about what it means to use evidence. And instead, people really feel like evidence is this thing that's been done to them, and folks are upset. And I think that's fueling a lot of the backlash. And so as we think, I think, forward in the long term about this evidence-based movement and how can we keep sort of in our own way getting better at this, we're going to have to think about this it's this top-down, bottom-up thing about how to create that balance that's going to satisfy constituencies in different places.
I love the fact that your presentation has stirred this much thought. You know, that this very simple notion that relationships matter, and that actually can be one of the most important levers in making change. It's something that is so obvious, but yet can really get lost in translation. So well done you for sort of bringing that to life for us. I think it's an important part of things. I'm going to ask the panel to take their seats in the audience now, and thank you very much. Big hand, big hands. Adam, before you come up, I have 2 more books. So this will represent the final stage of our raffle. So let's see. We've got John Smith III. It's a very jazzy card. Is he here? John? John, okay, John, you lost your book. John Smith, okay. Sorry, John. Okay. Jennifer Pivarena, you here, Jennifer? Okay, we got a book for you. And then last one, Carolyn Vincent. Carolyn, there you go. Okay. Thanks, Matt. Okay. So to close things off today, very lucky to have Adam Gammeren here from the William T. Grant Foundation to sort of bring this all together for us and offer some closing remarks.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much to the Center on Education Policy for hosting and coordinating this stimulating event. And thank you to George Washington University for providing such a terrific forum for it. It was really exciting sitting out in the audience, trying to revise my concluding comments to take into account what was said, and at the same time tweeting some of the most interesting and provocative statements. I didn't get to tweet the states are in revolt. Nor did I manage to put out there that there's a Jesuit in the Vatican and in the State House in Sacramento. 2 of potentially the most interesting tweets, which would have come right at the end. So I didn't manage to get those out there, but I got some others out, and a number of the members of the audience were tweeting. So this forum is reaching a wider audience than those of us who are in the room. So that's always exciting. Now, but to try to do that at the same time as I'm listening and taking notes, anyway, I wasn't bored, that's for sure. In introducing the conversation, my colleague Vivian Tseng challenged us to think about learning from research evidence. And that was a theme that I think pervaded the entire set of comments. As Kara Finnegan commented, we need to think about the use of research evidence as a learning process. And I want to think about this learning process as having a supply side and a demand side. So there's a question of what's the research evidence that is available, and how does it fit the decisions that we need to make on the one side? And how do potential consumers or users of research, that is, people who are making decisions, whether at the policy level or in the practice arena, how much do they perceive that evidence from research can valuably inform the decisions they have to make? So the supply side and the demand side. And I will claim, speaking here as someone who had a long career as a researcher, that we've made a lot of progress in improving the rigor of research evidence. That is, to the extent to which research evidence on education can be taken seriously for having something to say about what decision we might want to make. At the very least, we are much better at limiting our claims to the designs supported by the evidence that produce those claims. Thanks in large part to the Institute of Education Sciences, which now has a 13-year history of supporting research, evidence from research. We are no longer making claims about cause and effect from designs that don't support cause and effect. we're not able to make cause and effect claims about everything, and we have to be flexible and recognize that there are other forms of evidence that are valuable, but at least we're not claiming beyond what the evidence supports. So significant progress in at least the believability of the research evidence. But we still have much to do on the supply side. Our research evidence needs to be better contextualized. It's not just about what works, but what works for whom and under what circumstances. Because, of course, the decision maker isn't interested in the abstract. And what the average findings are, or what the average effect of a program or policy is only marginally of interest. What matters is not what the average effect is, but what the effect is going to be in my context, whether it's in Long Beach or in Baltimore or in Madison, Wisconsin, or in Washington, D.C., or in a rural district. It's the context that is crucial. We also we heard from the panelists the importance of timeliness in research evidence. So producing evidence about a program that was in place 10 years ago and was ended 7 years ago is of minimal value to a decision maker. So that's more that we need to do on the supply side of research evidence. And we need, this is one aspect of asking the right question. So we need to ask questions in research for which the answers would be valuable to decision makers. And here's where engagement is the direction we need to go. So we need to move from thinking about dissemination. Oh, let's get the research done and let's tell everybody about it, and then all the research will follow. No, we need to create forums of engagement between researchers and decision makers. And one of the reasons to do that is, again, on improving the supply side of research evidence, so that the questions that are asked and which motivate the research are ones whose answers will matter when it comes to decision making. But engagement also helps on the demand side. When researchers and decision makers are working together to construct research questions, then they are not only helping researchers to ask questions whose answers will be valuable, but they're also helping to create a culture of evidence among decision makers. And I think this holds whether the decisions are made at the policy level, let's say at the state or federal level, where it's a matter of regulations or allocation of resources, or at the practice level, whether it's a teacher in a classroom or a principal in a school making decisions about what programs or activities to engage with students. When researchers have a seat at the table, and when they are working together with decision makers to identify questions that need to be answered, there can be a cultural shift. A shift in which evidence is among the considerations for making decisions. Now, we recognize that decisions are never going to be made purely on the basis of evidence. And this is true for a variety of reasons. First of all, the research evidence is not fine-grained enough so that we have certainty about how some program or some practice will apply in our own context. Second of all, research evidence is context-bound, and we won't always know how it will apply in our context. Third of all, decisions are not only about evidence, they're about values. And it's not the researcher's job to determine what the values or preferences are. There was one of the founders of my discipline, sociology, said that social science evidence is like a road map. It can tell you how to get from point A to point B. But it can't tell you whether you want to go to point A. Maybe you want to go to point C. That's the political decision. And so decisions are always shaped by politics, always made in a political context. But if we can create a culture of evidence, then at least we will have evidence at the table. And I will assert, and it is our conviction, that decisions are more likely to lead to the desired outcomes when evidence is part of the equation. Knowing what policies or practices have resulted in certain outcomes in other contexts can increase the likelihood that taking those actions will also result in those outcomes in your context. And so if you're clear about what your preferences are, then using evidence to guide your decisions can help increase the chances of gaining the outcomes that you perceive. So what does it take to create these relationships? What does it take to create this kind of engagement? Well, what we heard a lot about today was relationships. And those relationships take time, they take investments, they take a building of human capital, they take technical expertise as well as a social dimension. And fundamentally, they take trust on the part of the decision maker and the researcher. We heard that building a partnership in which there's an engagement between researchers and decision makers takes capacity, both technical and relationship. And it takes incentives. Now, on the incentives, okay, so supply and demand. Now, on the incentive side, one of the challenges that came up in discussion today was about incentives for university-based researchers to engage in research that might be of use to someone who has to make an actual decision in a policy or practice setting. And here I want to take issue with what I regard as a false dichotomy between basic and applied research. And this is a point that my colleague Vivian Tseng has made, and I think we heard it today in Carmel Martin's comments about the need for practitioners to become more knowledgeable about basic findings. You know, it's not the case that theory is absent from research that can help drive practice. On the contrary, research that can help inform practice, or often called applied research, is strengthened by an infusion of theory to help understand and identify potential relationships that one needs to examine in order to find out what practices or programs are likely to be more effective. And my experience would challenge the notion that there are no rewards in university settings or no incentives in university settings for researchers to engage with the real world of practice. Certainly there are leading researchers, some of whom spoke to us today, who have engaged with the practice community and have been rewarded in their academic careers. But those research studies, such as the work by Kara Finnegan and Alan Daly, are informing not only specific practice contexts, but also increasing our understanding of how things work generally. And they're contributing to theory in the sense that they are identifying patterns that underlie these relationships of what works and what doesn't, and can help broaden our understanding and lead to better decisions in the future. So the analogy that Carmel described of brain science or of cognitive science is appropriate here. So it's understanding For example, it's understanding the phenomenon of stereotype threat and the social psychological conditions that help mitigate stereotype threat. That is the sense that I'm a member of a social category, people in my social category often fail on this task, therefore I'm going to perform poorly on that task. And when you understand that, when you understand the theory behind it, and you can identify social psychological activities, or use social psychological theory to identify activities that can buffer against stereotype threat and implement them in your real world setting or cause them to be adopted in your district, then you're drawing on theory to improve practice. And researchers in the academic world can get rewarded. For that. Now I want to also take issue with the distinction between UCLA and Cal State. It's not about being rewarded for tenure, it's about money. So what UCLA needs is not to move up in the U.S. News & World Report rankings because they have researchers who test theories. It's they need to get research funding. And whether it's from the Institute of Education Sciences or the William T. Grant Foundation or the Edna McDonald Clark Foundation, it's about gaining support for research studies. And so that's why we think that it's important for funders such as us and Institute of Education Sciences and others to be attuned to the need to carry out research that not only will contribute to testing theories, but will contribute to testing theories in ways that have relevance, that can matter ultimately to decision makers. Now, there's a very nice, everybody received a very nice blue packet of materials, and I want to draw your attention to one of these items called Harnessing Research Evidence to Improve Education. And I'd like to leave you with a couple of points that, amazingly, this is a handout from the William T. Grant Foundation, which pulls together some research that our grantees have carried out and some of the insights that we at the foundation have drawn from this research. And in this handout, we make 2 points about what we've learned. First of all, smart policy means knowing more than what works. It's absolutely an innovation to be more rigorous in the claims we make about what works and what doesn't. That, in my judgment, that's what I call the new education sciences. That was a huge step forward, but it's not enough. We need to know better about the circumstances under which things work and don't work. And we need to know more about the challenges that students and educators face in implementing programs that have been demonstrated to be effective in some contexts. And we need to generate research evidence not only on outcomes, so this is not just about testing hypotheses, but about interpreting and understanding the experiences and interactions that present support and obstacles to learning. And the second point is that, well, you heard a lot about this today, the future of evidence-based policy is engagement, it's collaboration, it's continuous improvement, it's building relationships between researchers and decision makers, between the supply side and the demand side, so that our decisions will be better informed and ultimately have a better chance to lead to the outcomes that we've preferred. So thank you all for coming, thank you to CEP, and thanks to all the speakers for a great session today.
Adam, thank you for doing such a great job. I really appreciate the excellent wrap-up. Thank you all for joining us, and we have recorded this event, and it will be posted